helped them buy that house. I watched their kids while they went out drinking. I lived in the basement, did the laundry, cooked the meals, stayed silent, because I believed that family isn't what you're given. It's what you build. But it turned out they had decided long ago that I was nothing more than part of the furniture. I never imagined my own niece would erase me from her life like an old burden she got tired of carrying. When they threw me out, I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just walked away. But what they never saw coming was that fate still had one last move left for me. And when I played that move, everything turned upside down. You can feel sorry for me. You can judge me. Or you can see yourself in this. Because this isn't just a story. It's a reckoning. And it's not over yet. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. When my husband died in early spring of 2017, it was like someone had suddenly cut the gravity in my life. We had spent 32 years together, through long nights, broken cars, holidays that were too quiet, and birthdays we tried to make louder than our grief. When he passed, I sold the house. I couldn't sleep there anymore. Every creak in the walls felt like his footsteps, every shadow like his silhouette. The rooms whispered his name too often, too clearly. I didn't have children of my own. Life didn't turn out that way for me, but I had Layla, my sister's daughter. I raised her after her mother died in a car accident when Layla was 8. I was the one who packed her lunches, taught her how to braid her hair, helped her learn her times tables. I was there for the tears when she didn't make the volleyball team in middle school, and for the screaming joy the day she got her college acceptance letter. I wasn't her mother by blood, but in all the ways that mattered, I was. She had grown up, married a man named Rick, and recently bought a house on the edge of Tucson. It was one of those beige suburban dreams with a 2-car garage and matching garden gnomes. Layla had called after the funeral. She said I could stay with them for a while. Her voice had been gentle, careful, like she was afraid I might shatter. I told her I'd think about it. A week later, I packed what was left of my life into 4 boxes, closed the door to my empty house for the last time, and headed to Arizona. The first few days were fine. The kids, 2 boys under the age of 7, were loud, sticky, full of questions. Rick mostly stayed out of my way, which I appreciated. I tried to make myself useful. I cooked dinner, tidied up, mended a torn curtain, and reorganized their pantry. Layla seemed grateful at first, a little tired maybe, but still warm. They gave me a room in the basement. It wasn't much. Concrete floor, a narrow window near the ceiling that barely let in any light, and a bed that creaked when I shifted my weight. But I was thankful. It felt safe, if not comfortable. I told myself I didn't need comfort. I needed proximity, family, a sense of being needed. I told Layla I'd help them with the mortgage. She hesitated, but I insisted. I wired over the money within the week, more than enough to cover their down payment. It felt right, like I was investing in something that would hold me steady. But slowly, something began to shift. Rick didn't thank me. Not really. He treated the money like a business transaction that had been settled. He started leaving his dirty laundry on the floor of the hallway, muttering under his breath when the boys got too loud and blaming me when dinner was late. I ignored it at first. I told myself he was just stressed from work. I began to feel like a live-in housekeeper. I washed dishes, ironed Rick's shirts, packed the kids' school lunches. Layla would smile, say things like, "I don't know what we'd do without you," but something in her voice felt distant, rehearsed. like she was saying it out of obligation, not gratitude. I wanted to believe I was helping. I wanted to believe that love was what I was giving. But then I overheard them late one night. They thought I was asleep. I had gone to bed early. My knees ached from standing too long in the kitchen. From the vent above my bed, I heard Rick's voice, low and annoyed. "She needs to back off. This isn't her house." Layla responded, but her voice was muffled. I couldn't catch every word. Something about me being lonely and trying to feel useful. Then Rick again, sharper this time. "Well, she's not helping. She's just hovering. I didn't sign up for a live-in babysitter/maid." I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, trying to breathe through the weight in my chest. My hands felt cold. My eyes stayed dry, but something inside me cracked just slightly. The next morning, no one mentioned the conversation. Layla asked if I could take the boys to soccer practice. Rick handed me his coffee mug to refill. I smiled. I nodded. I drove the boys, cheered from the bleachers, clapped even when they missed the ball completely. But that night, I unpacked my boxes again, slowly this time. I took out a picture of my husband, placed it on the nightstand in the basement. I sat beside it, running my fingers over the frame. I whispered to him that I missed him, that I wasn't sure what I was doing anymore. I told myself it was just a phase, that once the boys got older, things would change, that once Rick got used to me, he'd soften, that once Layla stopped being tired all the time, she'd remember what we used to have. But deep down, I knew better. They didn't see me as family. They saw me as an extra pair of hands, a budget line that helped them buy their house, a relic from another life that didn't quite fit in with this one. And still, I stayed. I stayed because I didn't know what else to do. Because admitting the truth that I had given everything to a family that saw me as a burden was more painful than enduring it in silence. That was my illusion. That closeness was something I could earn. That love, if poured out in enough meals and mended shirts and cleaned baseboards, would eventually be reflected back. But illusions have a way of breaking, quietly at first, then all at once. 1 year passed like a slow erosion. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, just a steady wearing down of my place in the world. A year of quiet corners, of footsteps muffled so as not to disturb, of swallowing words before they became burdens. A year of being useful, but never seen. Layla barely spoke to me anymore. She'd perfected the art of surface pleasantries. "Thanks. Sure. Could you grab the mail?" But never anything deeper. We used to sit for hours talking about books, about her dreams, about nothing in particular. Now I could pass her in the hallway and she wouldn't even lift her eyes from her phone. Rick, on the other hand, had no such subtlety. He had grown more direct, more bitter. He called me the antique, sometimes the old lady down in the dungeon, but most often the splinter. As in, "You're like a splinter, you don't kill anyone, but God, are you irritating." He said it with a smirk, like it was a joke. But jokes don't make your stomach twist. They don't make you flinch when you hear footsteps outside your door. He started using phrases like "my house" and "my rules" more often, as if to remind me I didn't belong. I stopped using the upstairs bathroom. I stopped watching TV in the living room. I stayed in the basement with my books, my knitting, my silence. The boys, once affectionate and chatty, began to change too. They started to look at me differently, hesitant, distant. Once, when I offered to read them a bedtime story, the youngest shook his head and whispered, "Daddy says you're spooky." The words hit me harder than they should have. I smiled and backed away. After that, I stopped trying. I became a quiet ghost in their home. I cleaned up quietly, folded their clothes, restocked the pantry. I learned to walk softer, breathe quieter. I stopped humming while I cooked. I didn't want to draw attention, not because I feared confrontation, but because I feared confirmation that I truly was, in their eyes, no longer part of them. Rick's comments became sharper. "You don't get to rewrite the past just because you're still hanging around," he said once when I reminded Layla about her mother's birthday. Another time, he muttered, "Why do old people never know when to leave?" when I came upstairs for tea. I ignored him. I always did. I told myself I was rising above, but inside it hollowed me out. I held on to small moments. When one of the boys scraped his knee and let me hold him for a second before Rick barked for him to come inside. When Layla once thanked me, absently, for doing the laundry. They were crumbs, but I was starving for something that felt like family, so I collected them like treasures. Then came the dinner. I'd spent the entire afternoon preparing it. Roasted chicken with lemon and rosemary, mashed potatoes from scratch, homemade biscuits, a recipe I used to make for Layla when she was a little girl and had had a bad day at school. She called it her comfort meal. I lit a candle. Nothing fancy, just something to make the room feel warm. I set the table, I poured water into glasses. I even put out cloth napkins. They came in late, the boys cranky and loud, Rick already annoyed. Layla looked tired. She said nothing when she saw the table set. Rick sat down, glanced at the food, and said nothing for a few seconds. Then he leaned back in his chair and laughed. A short, sharp sound. "Are we doing Thanksgiving now?" he asked. Didn't realize I needed a holiday to eat mashed potatoes. Layla didn't laugh. She just picked up a biscuit. Rick took one bite of the chicken, made a face, and stood up. "In my house," he said loud and clear. "We don't eat old lady food." He picked up the dish, walked to the trash, and dumped the entire contents of the platter into the bin. The sound of it, the weight of the food hitting plastic, was louder than anything anyone said. Layla sat frozen. The kids didn't understand. One asked if dinner went canceled. I said nothing. I looked at my hands, still smelling of garlic and rosemary, and that was the moment. Not the words, not the action, but the silence. No one stopped him. No one asked him what he was doing. No one defended the hours I had spent trying to do something kind, something familiar, something that felt like home. That's when I realized it wasn't my home anymore. Maybe it never was, but I stayed. I stayed because I told myself someone would eventually say thank you. That one day Rick would soften, that Layla would remember, that the boys would grow older and see things clearly. I stayed because I didn't know where else to go, because starting over at my age didn't feel like a brave new chapter. It felt like a punishment. I told myself they needed me, but the truth was, I needed them. Or at least, I needed to believe I still mattered to someone. That I hadn't become a relic collecting dust in someone else's life. I wasn't angry, not yet. Just tired, bone tired, the kind of tired that didn't come from work or age, but from trying too hard for too long to be visible to people who had already decided not to look. It was early evening when she came down the stairs. I heard the click of her heels on the basement steps before I saw her face. There was a certain rhythm to Layla's movements when she wanted something to sound casual, to feel like a conversation, not an execution. But her steps were too slow, too soft, like she already knew the weight of what she was about to say. She stood at the foot of the stairs, holding her hands together like she wasn't sure what to do with them. She didn't come in, didn't sit down, just hovered in the doorway between the basement and the rest of the house. exactly the space I'd been pushed into for the past year. Her eyes met mine with something I think she meant to be kindness or pity. I couldn't tell the difference anymore. She said her father-in-law had recommended a place, a beautiful home, one of those assisted living communities with cheerful names and brochures filled with smiling silver-haired people playing cards or gardening. I could almost hear the way Rick must have pitched it. A new chapter, your own space, your independence. Layla added that they'd already covered the first month, just to help with the transition. She said it like a gift, like it was something they had done out of generosity, not necessity, not strategy. She ended with a sentence that stuck in my chest like a shard of glass. You'll be happier there. I remember nodding. I remember smiling, or at least something that looked like it. I don't remember saying a word. My throat had closed up too tight for that. I didn't ask what would happen to the money I had given them. I didn't ask how long they had been planning this, or if the boys would even notice I was gone. I didn't ask because I already knew the answers, and none of them would have softened the blow. Instead, I waited until she left the room and closed the door behind her, softly, as if volume made a difference at that point. Then I sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, the same wall I had looked at for over a year, same chipped paint, same thin crack near the corner that I'd once tried to cover with a photo of Layla as a baby. That photo was now packed away, along with the few things I hadn't already learned to live without. I took 2 bags. That's all I allowed myself. One for clothes, one for keepsakes. My wedding ring, though I hadn't worn it in years. A scarf my husband gave me on our 25th anniversary. A stack of letters from my sister, long gone. And photographs, some framed, some loose, of a life that now felt like it belonged to someone else. I didn't cry while I packed. I didn't pause. I moved the way people move after they've been broken in slowly, piece by piece, efficiently, numbly, deliberately. I called a cab and didn't wait for goodbyes. I didn't say thank you. I didn't say I'd write. I didn't say anything at all. The motel I found was near the edge of Tucson, on a street that reeked of diesel fuel and lost chances. The kind of place where the vending machine has one working light and the lobby has a sign taped to the wall warning guests to keep their voices down after 10 p.m. My room smelled like old smoke and disinfectant, the kind of scent you get used to if you stay long enough. The window looked out onto a narrow alleyway between buildings. A trash bin leaned against the wall. A torn mattress lay beside it, half drenched in something I didn't want to name. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the carpet, brown with strange stains like ink blots, each one shaped like a question I didn't want to ask. That night, the silence pressed down on me like a second ceiling, heavier than the one above my head. I kept hearing Rick's voice in my mind calling me dead weight, a burden, a problem he finally found a solution to. But what haunted me more was Layla's face, the softness in her voice, the way she spoke as if she believed it, as if exiling me was a kindness, as if pushing me out of the house I had helped pay for, from the family I had carried on my back for years, was an act of compassion. That was the night I realized something terrifying. Not just that I was alone, but that I had been for a long time, even when I was still in their house. I was just easier to ignore when I was in the basement. I asked myself how I had gotten here, not just to this motel room, but to this version of myself, reduced, erased, ghost-like. How had I become someone so easy to cast aside? The woman I used to be. She would have never tolerated this. She would have fought. But grief does something to you. It rearranges your bones, hollows out your lungs. and somewhere along the way, I stopped breathing for myself. I was holding my breath for everyone else. I lay down on the stiff motel bed, staring up at the ceiling with its flickering light. And for the first time, I truly couldn't breathe. Not because of asthma or age, but because everything inside me had gone still. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to offer, nothing left to hope for. Just me, 2 suitcases, and a truth I didn't know what to do with. I had become a stranger in the family I built with my own hands. A few days after I moved into the motel, I started unpacking the second suitcase. The one I hadn't dared open the night I arrived. It sat in the corner of the room like a sealed memory, the kind that might unravel me if I looked too closely. The air in the room smelled like disinfectant and something metallic, but when I unzipped the bag, a different scent floated up. Dust, old fabric, and something faintly sweet, like pressed flowers left between the pages of a forgotten book. It was the suitcase I had packed in silence, the one with the pieces of my life that still mattered. At the very bottom, beneath a folded shawl and a faded photograph of my husband holding baby Layla in his arms, I found the box. A small cardboard one, with the edges softened by time and the corners slightly crushed from years of being tucked away in closets, under beds, in places meant for things you don't quite want to throw away. I didn't remember packing it. Maybe it had ended up in the bag during those frantic minutes of leaving. Or maybe I had known I needed it, even if I couldn't admit it then. I placed it on the bed and opened it slowly. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, some written in my mother's sharp, precise hand, others in unfamiliar script. Receipts from old trips, a few newspaper clippings, a dried corsage from a high school dance. Time had turned everything a shade yellower. The ink faded in places, but the emotions clung to the paper like ghosts. I wasn't looking for anything. I just needed to feel like I came from somewhere, that I hadn't been dropped into this moment without roots. That's when I saw it. A single envelope, sealed, thicker than the others. It was addressed to me. My full name, written in a style I had never seen before, elegant, deliberate. The ink had bled slightly around the curves, and the paper smelled different from the rest, richer, older. It was dated July 1980. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it for a long time before touching it. The return address had no street or number, just a name, C. Hartwell. I didn't recognize it, but I recognized something else, a feeling, a tug in my chest, deep and strange, like memory trying to claw its way up through my ribs. I opened the envelope carefully, as if I might damage the contents just by breathing too hard. The letter inside was handwritten, 3 full pages, neatly folded. The first line stopped my heart. "My name is Charles Hartwell, and I am your father." I read it 3 times before I could believe it. He wrote about my mother, how they had met in Santa Fe, how it had never been meant to last, but how it had never really ended either. He hadn't known I existed until years later. By then, my mother had made it clear she wanted nothing from him. Not money, not help, not presents. But he had stayed nearby anyway, just in case, he wrote. In case one day things changed. They never did. He said he tried writing to me once, when I was a teenager, but never mailed the letter. He kept it, along with others, in a box he left with someone he trusted, a lawyer named Douglas Rain in Denver, Colorado. The letter explained that if I ever needed anything, if I ever felt truly lost, this man could help me. Not emotionally, not as a father might, but legally, logistically. Because Charles Hartwell, it turned out, had owned several pieces of land, Small properties, mostly rural, parcels he had invested in over the years with no intention of building on them, just holding them quietly. He had no other children, no spouse, and he had set things in motion so that if I ever came looking, it would be mine. It sounded like a story someone would tell a lonely woman to keep her from falling apart. I folded the letter slowly and held it to my chest. The paper had a weight to it, as if it carried more than just ink and words. It carried breath and regret, and something that might have been love if it had been allowed to grow. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the motel bed with the letter beside me and stared at the ceiling, trying to imagine the face of a man I never knew, who apparently had never stopped thinking of me. I tried to recall anything my mother might have said over the years, any hint, any slip, but she had been silent, fiercely so. In the morning, I found the name of the law office online, Rain and West, LLC. It still existed. The website was simple, nothing flashy, just a list of services, a few credentials, and a phone number. I stared at it for nearly an hour before picking up the phone. The woman who answered sounded polite but distant until I said his name, Douglas Rain. Then something changed in her voice. She asked me to hold. When she returned, she said Mr. Rain was retired, but still came into the office twice a week. She said he'd be in on Friday and that he'd want to speak with me. I hung up the phone and immediately doubted myself. What if it was all a mistake? What if the letter was a lie, a cruel game, or worse, just a delusion born of grief? But something deeper whispered that it wasn't, that even if it was the smallest thread, it was still mine to pull. By Thursday night, I had packed again. Not much, just the essentials. I left the motel key on the nightstand and wrote a short note thanking the manager. Then I bought a one-way bus ticket to Denver. The ride was long and strange. Desert giving way to plains, the air growing thinner as the road climbed. I sat near the window and watched the landscape shift, 1,000 shades of brown and gold rolling by. I didn't speak to anyone. I didn't sleep much. I held the letter in my lap the entire way. When the bus finally pulled into the station in downtown Denver, I felt something stir in my chest. Not hope, not quite, but the echo of it. The ghost of what hope used to feel like before life had taught me otherwise. I stepped off the bus with stiff legs and tired eyes and told myself, this isn't the end. This isn't even the middle. It's just the next page, and somewhere out there, behind a quiet office door, a man who knew my father was waiting. When I stepped into the office of Rain and West, it felt like I had walked into another time. The place was quiet, lined with polished wood panels and bookshelves that reached to the ceiling. Folders stacked in perfect order filled the cabinets, each labeled by hand. The air smelled of old paper and furniture polish, touched with something faintly like cedar. It wasn't a sterile law firm. It was a room that had held secrets for decades. Douglas Rain looked like he belonged there. Tall, older, with silver hair and a presence that didn't ask for attention, but commanded it anyway. His handshake was warm, his voice steady. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He offered me a seat across from a large desk with iron legs and laid a single folder in front of me. The paper inside was thick and cream-colored, the kind that rustled when turned. This, he said, his tone gentle but formal, has been waiting for you for a long time. He walked me through it, page by page. I listened in silence, barely breathing. A trust had been established years ago under my father's direction. Not a grand fortune, not a billion-dollar empire, but substantial. More than anything I had ever imagined owning. A 6-figure account, a legal share in a commercial building located in a rising neighborhood not far from downtown Denver. Rental units, tenants, a structure that paid for itself, quietly generating income all these years. There had been instructions, too, that the assets were to remain untouched until I came forward, that no one else could claim them, that if I never did, the money would be donated to a scholarship fund in my mother's name. But I had come. I was there, and now it was all mine. Douglas slid a pen across the table. "You only need to sign to make it official," he said. I picked up the pen. My hand trembled slightly, but not with fear, with something quieter, something steadier. I signed my name at the bottom of the final document, my full name, the same name that had once been scribbled in the margins of school permission slips and stitched into my wedding veil. But this time, it felt different. It felt like ownership. When I was done, Douglas looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't say anything trite. He just folded the papers neatly, slipped them into a manila envelope, and placed them in my hands like an offering. I thanked him. I stood, and I walked out the door. Outside, the air was cold and crisp. A sharp wind rushed through the street, lifting the edges of my coat and making the edges of my eyes sting. The traffic hummed nearby, horns, footsteps, voices. But for a moment the world felt still. I stopped at the edge of the sidewalk and tilted my face toward the sky. I inhaled, deep, full. For the first time in what felt like years, my lungs didn't stop short. The breath filled me completely. Not the shallow kind I had become used to, the kind you take when you're trying to be small, when you're afraid to take up space, but a real breath, one that told my body I was allowed to exist again. I held it in for a second, then let it go. I didn't cry. I didn't laugh or raise my arms to the sky like someone in a movie. I just stood there, quietly with the envelope clutched against my chest, and felt something shift inside me. Not just relief, not just closure. Power. Not the kind you flaunt, the kind you carry in your spine, the kind you feel in the center of your being when you realize you don't have to beg anymore. For so long, I had been surviving in the shadows of other people's choices, living as a guest in the life I helped build, holding my breath, stepping lightly, offering help no one asked for but everyone expected. And for what? A room in the basement, a silent eviction, a message delivered with a smile that said, "You'll be better off somewhere else." But now I had a deed. I had a name on paper. I had something no one could take or explain away. I wasn't going back to Tucson. Not like before, not as the woman they dismissed, the woman they labeled a burden and tucked away like an extra suitcase. No, if I ever returned, I'd walk in differently, not to reclaim what was lost, but to show them what they never saw in the first place, that I had strength, that I had history, that I had a name they had never bothered to learn properly. But the truth was, I didn't even want to go back. The idea of building something new here in Denver filled me with a kind of quiet hunger I hadn't felt since I was much younger. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to throw anything in their faces. I just needed space, a place to put down roots that weren't tangled in guilt. As I walked down the block, people passed me without notice, but I felt taller, lighter. I wasn't invisible anymore, not to myself, and that was the only beginning I needed. A new name on the deed, a new chapter in the story, mine. The day I signed the final documents, I felt nothing. Not pride, not triumph, just silence. The kind of silence that settles into your bones after you've been ignored for so long you forget how to make noise. I sat in the modest office of my real estate attorney, watching his pen glide across the last line, transferring ownership of a squat 2-story building just outside Tucson to a shell company with no traceable connection to me. My name was nowhere, and yet every square foot of that property now answered to me. I didn't buy it for profit. I bought it for peace. At least that's what I told myself. The building wasn't special. Stuccoed walls faded by sun, palm trees swaying out front like they had been planted out of habit, not intention. It had 12 units, a tiny laundry room with a flickering bulb and a smell of old pipes and dust in the hallways. But it had potential. More than that, it had a vacancy. And 2 weeks later, that vacancy was filled. They arrived on a Thursday. A moving truck pulled into the parking lot around noon, too large for the narrow turns. I watched from my car across the street. Lined up with tinted windows, parked under the shade of a dusty eucalyptus tree. My hands didn't shake. I thought they might, but they didn't. Layla stepped out first. Her hair was lighter now, streaked with salon blonde. She wore oversized sunglasses and carried a clipboard like she was managing the world. Rick followed behind, barking at the movers, waving his arms, looking irritated before anything had even gone wrong. I watched them laugh with the leasing agent, hand over papers, keys. They didn't recognize her. She was just an intermediary, a woman hired to represent the company on paper. They smiled, they shook hands, they stepped inside their new home, my home. That night, I sat by the window of my rental in Denver, sipping tea and staring at a spreadsheet. Lease details, utilities, ZAS, unit-specific charges. I highlighted one line, Unit 2C, their unit. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for just a moment. Then I typed, adjustment to reflect revised market value based on unit-specific assessment, effective immediately. The increase was threefold, triple what every other tenant would pay. No explanations, no exceptions. The rest of the building received a symbolic bump, a polite 5% to keep things quiet, fair, almost invisible. I pressed save. The email went out automatically the next morning, a standard notice from the property management system. Neutral language, legal tone, a formality really. 3 days passed. On the 4th, I received an alert from the management portal. One tenant requesting clarification on rent adjustment. The name attached was generic, a placeholder through a leasing agency they'd used. No mention of Layla, no mention of Rick, but I knew it was them. I watched as the messages rolled in. First polite, then confused, then angry. Rick's words, I assumed. Short sentences, capital letters, words like unfair and extortion. I said nothing. I responded to no one. The property manager replied on my behalf with pre-approved scripts and polite rejections. Market correction, annual review. Terms were disclosed at signing. They had signed, willingly, smiling, holding a lease they hadn't read closely. The irony sat heavy in my chest like a secret too perfect to spoil. I didn't visit the property. Not in person, I didn't need to. The cameras I had installed through the building gave me everything I wanted. Silent footage, the flicker of hallway lights, the weight of expression when Layla walked past the mailboxes, her face tense. Rick storming out one morning, slamming the front door so hard it shook the frame. None of the other tenants complained, only them. I wasn't cruel. I didn't single them out with slurs or notes or confrontation. I simply applied pressure, quietly, legally, systematically, and I never broke the silence. The building began to change. I approved repainting the hallway walls, replaced the carpeting with new laminate flooring, upgraded the landscaping. I gave small rent reductions to single mothers and retired couples who lived there peacefully, but not them. They got no discount, no warmth. Only cold paper notices slipped under the door. Sometimes, late at night, I would open the tenant dashboard and reread their lease, line by line, just to remind myself that it was real, that they were living under my roof, paying me for the right to wake up each morning in a place I owned, breathing the air I allowed. It wasn't revenge, I told myself. It was balance. It was the quiet kind of justice, wordless and slow, the kind that doesn't need to be witnessed to count. They didn't need to know my name. They didn't need to hear my voice. All they needed was to feel the shift beneath their feet, a life slightly less comfortable, a burden with no name, just like the one they gave me. And still, I waited. Not for a thank you, not even for an apology. I waited for the moment they would finally ask, "Who owns this place?" And when they did, if they did, it wouldn't matter. Because by then I wouldn't just be their landlord, I would be the silence they never saw coming. The first call came from an unknown number. I didn't answer. Then came another, a different number but the same urgency. I watched them flash across the screen like sirens in the distance. I let them ring until they stopped. The voicemails followed, hesitant voices, unfamiliar names, vague questions about lease changes, about rent, about unforeseen increases. They never used my name. They didn't know it. That was the beauty of it, the protection in invisibility. The shell company I'd set up didn't trace back to me. On paper, I was just a silent investor, but the messages kept coming. Eventually, the texts began. First from unlisted numbers, then one from a contact I had deleted long ago. Layla. Her name, once a lifeline, now looked strange on my phone screen. She didn't start with a greeting, just a plea. "Please, if there's anything you can do about the rent, let me know. We're drowning." I stared at it for a long time. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, then retreated. I didn't type a word. I didn't need to. More followed. Voice notes this time. Her voice cracking, tired, stripped of the superiority she once wore like armor. "I don't know who to talk to. Rick's getting worse. The kids don't sleep. We're behind on everything. If you know anything, please." Still, I said nothing. At night, I stood by my window and looked across the courtyard at their unit. Their lights flickered inconsistently, sometimes bright, sometimes dark. I imagined them arguing over bills, over blame, over each other. It wasn't hard to picture. I'd lived in their shadow long enough to know how their tempers sounded when stretched. I remembered the day Rick threw out the soup I made, calling it old people food. I remembered the snide comments about my perfume, my dated clothes, the way they smirked when I asked if I could plant herbs near the back porch. I remembered the heaviness of packing my life into 2 suitcases while they stood at the top of the stairs like jailers sending me off to exile. That memory didn't sting anymore. It simply stood, whole and unmovable, like a monument to a version of me they thought would never rise again. Now I stood in my own apartment. Hardwood floors, high ceilings, south-facing windows that let in golden light in the morning, a table set for 1, but with matching place settings for 4, just in case. A vase of fresh flowers sat in the center. I bought them every Friday, not for anyone else, for myself. Each morning, I made coffee the way I liked it. 2 sugars, oat milk, just shy of boiling. I took my time sipping it while reading the paper in print, not on a screen. I wasn't rushed. No one barked orders. No one asked what I was making for dinner. My life was my own again, in ways I hadn't realized I'd surrendered. Still, the messages from Layla kept coming. "I know we haven't been close, but please, the new landlord, whoever they are, they're making it impossible to live here." That one made me pause, not because I pitied her, but because of the way she said it. They're making it impossible to live here. Not we're trying our best, not we're sorry for how things went, just blame, just desperation when the roof they leaned on started cracking. Some nights, I caught my reflection in the darkened glass. It startled me how different I looked. I wasn't thinner or older. I was quieter in my face, like something had settled there, something permanent. The woman staring back at me had fewer questions. She no longer searched for approval in other people's eyes. She simply stood still, watching. I didn't feel joy when I saw their pain, but I did feel justice. Justice isn't always loud. It doesn't always come in the form of courtroom decisions or public apologies. Sometimes it's as simple as the phone you don't pick up, the message you don't return, the silence you hold like a shield. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was claiming space. Space I had once begged for. Space I had earned with every meal I cooked, every load of laundry I folded, every night I sat alone in that basement, wondering what part of myself I had to shrink to be loved. Now I didn't shrink. I expanded. I grew into the woman I used to imagine only in my boldest daydreams, the one who didn't need to explain, didn't need to ask, didn't need to be small to be safe. And yet, when I looked at their windows, when I saw their silhouettes moving like shadows behind cheap blinds, I didn't hate them. I simply no longer needed them. That was the real victory. Not their suffering, my release. The room smelled faintly of coffee and carpet cleaner. The folding chairs creaked as people sat down, shifting their coats and bags, murmuring softly to each other. I arrived early and took a seat near the front, not because I wanted to be seen, but because I wanted to see clearly. The sunlight streamed in through the tall windows behind me, outlining my silhouette in a pale glow. I wore a charcoal gray suit, tailored sharp at the shoulders, soft at the cuffs. My hair was darker now, shorter, styled close to my face in a way that made me feel both new and entirely myself. I held a leather folder in my lap. Inside were the documents I no longer needed to prove anything. They were just symbols now of all the steps I had taken from the night I stood outside their house with 2 bags and a fractured heart. Symbols of silence turned into structure, of dignity reclaimed. People filed in slowly. Some tenants I recognized from emails and payment logs. Others were new. A few nodded politely. One man smiled as he passed, thanking me again for the repaired plumbing. I returned his smile with a quiet nod. Then the door opened again. I felt it before I turned. Layla. She stepped inside wearing a wrinkled blouse and faded jeans. Her face looked thinner, her posture tighter. She held a small notebook to her chest like a shield. Rick followed behind her. His walk was still the same, too loud for the space, elbows wide, presence inflated, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted quickly, scanning the room. He was looking for someone to blame, someone to corner. He didn't find me. They didn't recognize me. Layla walked within 3 feet of where I sat. Her gaze passed over me like wind over glass, soft but entirely unaware. I studied her in that moment, the way her shoulders pulled slightly inward, the fine lines around her mouth deepening when she frowned. This was not the girl I had raised. This was a woman shaped by choices she couldn't undo, and a silence she had never prepared to break. I waited. The building manager stood at the front of the room and began the meeting. Routine updates, notices of upgrades, clarifications about new policies. The hum of procedural business filled the air. Rick whispered something to Layla and rolled his eyes. She didn't respond. Then the manager turned to me and nodded once. I stood. The sound of my chair scraping back was soft, but to me it rang like a bell. I walked to the front of the room slowly, each step measured, deliberate. The floor underfoot was tiled, clean, and cold. I could feel the stiffness of my blazer around my ribs. My pulse was steady. I turned to face the room. My voice was calm, clear, quiet. I introduced myself as the owner of the building. That was all I said. Just my name, my title, nothing more. I watched the realization ripple through the room like wind through a wheat field. A few people looked confused, others surprised. Then I saw it. The moment Layla recognized me. Her mouth parted slightly, her hand tightening around the notebook. She didn't speak. She didn't move. Her eyes widened, then filled with something I couldn't name. Not fear, not sorrow, something rawer than either. Rick, however, reacted with the same noise he always carried. He stood abruptly, his chair crashing back, and pointed at me. He yelled. He called the rent hikes criminal. He accused the building of being run by a fraud. He demanded to know what kind of game was being played. I didn't answer. I didn't blink. I just looked at him. For the first time in my life, I saw Rick as small. Not because I had grown taller, but because he had finally stopped standing on the shoulders of my silence. His bluster was thin now, hollow. His face was red, but his fists didn't clench. He didn't know what to do with the version of me standing in front of him. Layla sat, frozen, pale. She looked from him to me and back again. Her mouth moved once, twice, then stopped. I could see the weight of recognition settling into her, the dots connecting, the lines tracing backward to the basement, to the bags, to the silence she had let fill the space between us for too long. Still, I said nothing. I turned to the manager, thanked him for his help, and nodded to the tenants. Then I walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't deliver a speech. I didn't make them sit through a performance about betrayal and rebirth. I simply left. But I didn't lock the door behind me. I left it open just enough. Not because I expected them to follow, but because they needed to know I had never been the one who shut it in the first place. I sold the building exactly 1 year after the day I first stepped into that meeting room and faced the people who once made me feel invisible. It wasn't a dramatic decision. There was no final argument, no sudden revelation. It was quiet, intentional, and deeply mine. I signed the papers in the same lawyer's office where I had first learned about the inheritance. The windows still overlooked the street with the same dusty blinds, but I was not the same woman who once walked in there, clinging to a letter and a name. The sale went smoothly. The money transferred to my account in silence. I didn't buy anything extravagant. I didn't take a trip to Europe or throw a party. I had other plans, the kind that didn't need applause to matter. I took part of the money and opened a small center in Flagstaff, a support space for women like me, women who had been silenced, sidelined, shut out, women who had carried whole families on their backs only to be told they were no longer needed. I named the center after my mother, Eleanor House. It felt right. She'd lived in the shadows her entire life, loving fiercely and quietly. It was time her name stood on something solid. The center wasn't large. It had 3 rooms and a shared kitchen. But it was warm. There was always coffee brewing, always a soft chair to sit in, and always someone ready to listen. I volunteered there often, especially in the early days. I hosted journaling circles and wrote letters to women who reached out from towns I had never heard of. Sometimes they just wanted to know they weren't alone. I understood that need better than most, but I wanted something even quieter for myself. So I searched, not on websites, not through brokers. I asked around. I waited. And then one morning I found it, a small house nestled near a lake outside Whitefish, Montana. It wasn't perfect. The roof needed repair. The porch creaked. The garden had long been forgotten, overrun with wild mint and blackberry vines. But when I stood by the edge of the water and looked at the way the sky met the trees, I knew. This was where I would live the rest of my story. Not in exile, not in bitterness, but in peace. I moved in with only what mattered. My mother's diary, a few photographs, a worn baking tin that still carried the smell of cinnamon if I closed my eyes just right. I painted the walls in soft blues and warm grays. I built bookshelves. I planted tomatoes in the spring and wildflowers in the fall. I baked bread every Saturday, the kind that filled the house with the kind of smell that made you feel held, even if no one else was there. Eventually, I got a dog, a quiet mutt from a shelter. She had a crooked tail and a gentle nature. I named her June, after the month my life had begun again. Sometimes I walked by the lake in the early morning when the fog was still curled like breath across the surface. I thought about all the versions of myself I had outgrown. The one who waited for thank yous, the one who whispered apologies just for taking up space, the one who mistook survival for living. I wrote letters to women who needed reminders. I told them it was never too late, that endings were not failures, that silence was not weakness if it was chosen, that starting over didn't mean erasing who you had been, it meant reclaiming her. And then one day, I found the postcard. It was tucked in between the electricity bill and a coupon flyer. No return address, no name. Just a lake scene on the front, almost identical to the one outside my window. Inside, there was only 2 lines, written in soft, uncertain handwriting. I understand now. I'm sorry. Thank you for teaching me. No signature, no hint, but my hands trembled just slightly as I read it. I didn't know for sure if it was Layla. I never would. And maybe that was the point. I placed the postcard in a small wooden frame and set it on the mantel above the fireplace, right next to the photo of me and June on the porch swing and the dried bouquet from the first garden I had planted. I didn't need the words to be confirmed. Some messages are felt more than read. Some apologies don't arrive wrapped in clarity. They come folded in silence, stitched into the spaces where trust was once torn. But I felt it, and that was enough. That little postcard became more than paper. It was proof that pain could teach, that silence could heal, that the loudest, "I am strong," often comes with no voice at all, only a heartbeat, a breath, a choice. And in that house, by that lake, with bread rising in the oven and a dog curled at my feet, I knew something I had once feared I'd never believe again. I was home, not because I had found the perfect place, but because I had become it.